We're going to look at a proof that uses the converse of some of the theorems we've been looking at. So for example, before we could assume that if we had two parallel lines, then corresponding angles are congruent. Now, if we have two corresponding angles that are congruent, then we can assume that there are two parallel lines. This can be challenging because we're used to be able to kind of hop around and then prove that the two angles were congruent. We can't hop around as much as we used to be able to. I'll show you what I mean. If we have these two lines that we don't know are parallel and then it's cut by a transversal, we can't assume that these two corresponding angles are congruent. So you're only allowed to work up and down the transversal that cuts across two parallel lines. So in this example, we're given that P is parallel to Q. What I would do is circle your transversals. Here's a transversal of P and Q, and this is another transversal. The reason I would circle them is because now we can see where we can assume congruence. So the first step, we always want to start with the given. We're trying to prove that L and M are parallel. Let's try to connect 1 and 13. So we're starting with 1, let's say 1 and 5 for example. There are many ways you can do this. But angle 1 is congruent to angle 5. We're working up and down the transversal that's cutting across two parallel lines, so we can assume that the corresponding angles are congruent. That's from the corresponding angle theorem. But now, where we used to be able to assume that angles 5 and 13 are congruent because they're corresponding angles, we can't assume that anymore because we don't know that this transversal is cutting across two parallel lines. So we have to somehow use some kind of substitution. If you look back in the problem, angle 1 is congruent to angle 5, and angle 1 is also congruent to angle 13. That means that angle 13 is congruent to angle 5. And that was by the transitive property, or substitution. And we just proved that angles 5 and 13 are congruent. And because they're corresponding angles and they're congruent, now we know that it must be cutting across two parallel lines. So lines L and M must be parallel. And that's because corresponding angles are congruent.